Hello CS300 and welcome to my video on strings. If you're completely unfamiliar with them, then I really hope this video will be helpful for you. If you are sort of just watching this to review, then I would definitely recommend speeding this video up and watching it at a faster pace. I don't want this video to be too long, so I will probably just jump right into it. So the first thing I want to go over is just simply how to declare a string. And it's pretty simple. So first, of course, you have to specify what kind of object that you would like to create, which in this case is a string. And then we can name it whatever we want. We want it to be a good name. So let's say we are talking about TV shows. So I'll name this TV show. And then we have our assignment to let's say Game of Thrones. Okay, and this right here is what's called a string literal. And one important thing to know about this is that it has double quotes around it, which is a good indicator that it's a string literal, along with maybe the string assignment. But you can see that that's different from what a char would look like here. Which only has the single quotes around it. I wanted to kind of put a side-by-side comparison. Yeah, that's just a little thing to note, I guess. Okay, so that's the basics of creating a string literal, but for this next part, I'm going to be talking about assigning strings to other strings, and I want to show what that looks like in memory, so I'm going to hop over to Java Visualizer to kind of represent that. Okay, so now we're here in Java Visualizer. One important option on Java Visualizer that I love to use is actually showing the string whatever objects that you're using and not just values, which if I click that, then that will essentially actually visually show the objects in memory, which can be really helpful if you're just kind of learning this sort of stuff. If you don't know about heap versus stack memory, then I definitely recommend looking that up. That's a very important concept in programming. Okay, so we have our string here, and I'm going to add another string called favShow, and then assign it to the string literal. So now it's a reference to the string literal Doctor Who. And an important thing to know about strings is that you can actually assign one string to another string and then have them be a reference to the same object. And I'll show you what I mean by reference if you don't really get that. So I have TV show equals favShow. And now if I visualize the execution, you can see that first of all, they start out as separate objects. So we have our two objects. But then when I execute this line, then they both are referring to one object. So that's what I meant by references too. This is why it's sometimes best to actually specify that you're creating a new string if you do two identical strings. So if I had two identical strings here, then there will actually be references to the same object, and depending on what you want in your program, well, you might not want that. And so it's actually sometimes better to specify that it's a new string. And so now when we do this, there will be references to different ones, even though they are identical, which is something that sometimes you'll want. This leads us to kind of our first method in Java, and a very important thing to know, and that's the dot equals method. So dot equals is a way to tell if two strings are, well, equal to each other, which makes sense. So if we wanted to know if these two strings are equal to each other, then we just do our TV show. And then of course, when we use a method, we do our dot equals, and then dot equals would take in a parameter of another string. And so now we can see if they are equivalent to each other, which of course they are because they're the same show. we can see this. And yeah, it's true that they do equal each other. And sometimes people will not know about this important method and instead they'll do equals equals because that's kind of the first thing that you learn in programming. But it's really important to know that this will not be true because equals equals is comparing where they are in memory, not the actual strings themselves. So if you see this, it's actually going to be false because they're in different spots in memory. But if I changed it to where I wasn't specifying it was a new string, then these two would actually be referencing the same object. And so now equals equals will be true, which is why you should never use equals equals because it's kind of wishy-washy which one it's going to do. You don't know if they're going to be referring to the same place in memory or not. So now to go on to the rest of our methods, I'm going to switch back to Eclipse. Okay, so the last thing I want to go over with string basics is empty strings versus null strings. And there's a huge difference between the two. So an empty string, as you can see here, is explicitly made to be empty. It's intentionally made that way. But with this like str2, you can see here, it's assigned to null, and null just means that it has no value whatsoever. An empty string has a value, a null string does not. And you can kind of demonstrate this with, well, I guess you could do it with any method, but I'm going to use .length because that's our next method anyway. So if I do system.out.print and I did str1.length, I'm going to be getting, so .length will be returning an integer to me, and that integer is basically what the length of my string is. And in this case, it should be 0 because str1 is an empty string. But if I tried to use this method on str2, we actually run into a huge issue, and that is a null pointer exception. And these, I know you don't know what exceptions are yet, maybe you do, but technically we haven't learned about that yet. But just know that it's because you're dereferencing something that hasn't even been assigned yet because it's null. And so that's a huge issue. But in general, str length will just give us the length of our string, as I said. So if I had a length CS300, then this would give me the length of that string, and that's 5. An important thing to note too is that it does count white space. So if I added a bunch of white space here, and then I recompile it and run it, then I have 22 now, and that's because it's including all this white space here. So that's pretty important to know. So that's it for .length. So char@ returns a character within a specific point within a string. So if I had some string called course and it had CS300 and I wanted to maybe get the first letter within it or the last one, this comes in handy when you're trying to alphabetize things or something like that. You might want to use this. But one really important thing is that char@ uses indices, or it wants you to specify what index it's at, which you might be familiar with that in context of arrays and array lists. If not though, then just know that 0 is now actually going to be the first spot in the string, which is kind of just a weird thing that computer science does. It now goes, so this is 0, C is 0, S is 1, 3 is 2, 3, and then the last one is 4. And that's kind of different from our .length method because .length actually gave us the whole length of the string. And in this case, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's 5. But if we wanted to get the last one, then we only want to get up to 4 because this method starts at 0. And so if you want to get the last character within a string, you actually have to do length -1. And now we get 0 because that's the last one. So that's it for char@. So now we're on to one of the weirder methods, and that's the split method, which basically takes a string literal and it splits it up into an array, actually. That's what it returns, an array. And so in this case, I am going to create a string array, of course, called R, and I'm going to use the split method. So the split method takes in one parameter, and that parameter is what you're splitting the string on. And so if that's confusing, I think it's easier for me to just kind of show it. And then I'm going to make a for loop and print this out. Oops, okay. And now I'm printing out the contents of the array. And so if I run this, then you see I have all these things split up into this array. And it was separated, these were all separated by a comma and a space, which is why that's what I chose to split it up. But you can use any string in the split method if that's what all these are separated by. And so that's why it's called split. Pretty apt name, I guess. So now if I run it, I get the same thing. I was just splitting it based on that string instead. Either way, it adds it to an array, and that's basically what you need to know about it. So now moving on to our .substring. Substrings have basically two options. Either you can put in one parameter or you can put in two. If you put in one, then basically what this will do, well, I guess I'll just show you. It's a little easier to show you than to describe it myself. Apples from Trader Joe's. Okay, so if I put in, if I just want to get the store name, here I'll actually save this in a variable, store. Well, that's Trader Joe's, and I don't want the rest of the string, and so I just want the end part. And to get the end part, then I just need to specify an index to start from, and then it'll take in all the rest of the string from there. And in this case, that'd be, and also since it's an index, of course, it starts at 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I want to start at index 12 and then get all the rest of the string for my substring. So I'm going to do purchase.substring index 12. And then if I print this out, then I will have Trader Joe's. Cool. But there may come a time when you want to get something in the middle of the string or maybe at the beginning. And in that case, then you need to specify a start index and an end index. And that is a little bit weirder. Can't spell. So you have a begin index and an end index then, like I said, and your begin index is going to be inclusive, just like it was here, because technically if you have one parameter, that's just begin index. And what I mean by inclusive is just, of course, it's going to include that character. But the end index, on the other hand, is actually exclusive, so it will not include it. So if I wanted to just get the particular food that I purchased, then I would start at 0, because that would include a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And since it's exclusive on the end though, I want to go to 6 because I want to make sure I get all my characters for food. And then I'll do, and then food. Okay, and you can see I bought apples. Cool, and that's pretty much it for substring. My last two methods are pretty much very similar, and so I'm just going to kind of talk about them together. So sometimes you have a string and you want to use that as an integer or maybe as a double, and the way you do that is with these two methods. And so if I wanted to get convert it to an integer. So I can store this actually in some integer value, and then I can actually use this method to turn the string number here into an integer, which is sometimes just helpful, and you'll probably use it throughout your programs. Yeah, so that will now be stored in an integer, and that's all good. And then similarly, if you wanted to get a double, then you could use double dot value of, and then number, and now this is stored in a value. And if you print out, oops, if you print out num then you get 52 and 52.0, because of course doubles add on this point here. Okay, so that's pretty much it for all the methods that I wanted to show you guys. One last thing I wanted to talk about quick are the Java docs. Java docs are a really powerful tool to know about when you're learning and writing in Java. Basically, you just have all these different classes, and since Java obviously has all these built-in methods along with particular objects, then you should go to places like the Java docs to figure out what all those are and what all those do. So you can see a couple that we learned: equals, char at, but you can also see that there's so many here. And so if you want to know everything that you should know, this is the place that you should go. I will be posting a link in the video description to the Java docs, but if you ever want to find them, you really can just go in your search engine and then look for example, string Java docs, and it'll probably be the first result from Oracle. So that's all I had for you guys today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this video was helpful. I know that you will be using some of this throughout your programs. If you have any questions about it, please feel free to email me or ask any of the instructors of the course. Thanks.